Brought to you by DCP Player version 2, available now. Now let's look at what a film producer should aim for. Now, a film producer will always be making some Blu-rays and DVDs for promotional reasons, usually for sending it out to be promoted to some cinemas or etc. But at the end of the day, if you're going to show a film properly at Hollywood sort of standards, we're going for a DCP. Now, it's the best quality file format around, and you know, they basically pretty future-proofed it. It's basically 444 12-bit, which is even higher than the quality of what a lot of people do with uncompressed recording for the actual creation or the online versions of the feature film. So it's a very high quality, so it'll get what the DI can represent. It'll get that on the screen if it's there. DI being the digital intermediary, where it's basically the highest online version of the film. And how do we get to a DCP? We'll talk about what to supply. Video files, audio files, and subtitle files will need to be supplied to a DCP creation facility. Color management is very difficult. You need to talk to the encoder. It's actually very difficult, and usually, if you don't know what I'm talking about, that means you really need to talk to someone who does. Remember, DCPs are of two resolutions, which are slightly different to what we know in the video world. 1998 by 1080 flat and 1248 by 858 scope. So you need to master to suit that. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. And if you need encryption, do you need it or not? Well, we'll talk about that a bit later too, because it's a questionable thing and it costs considerably more to do that. What to do when you're doing it on the cheap? Well, like I said before, these cinema networks in different regions, for example, Australia, New Zealand, India, Nepal, have ones which that use some of our technology. But there's different e-cinema solutions around the world, and they support different file formats. If you are based in those parts of the world, you could possibly use one of those e-cinema solutions to do distribution. It's cheaper than DCI in some ways, cheaper to encode, cheaper to distribute, because you can use more, cheaper drives and smaller drives, and it can be a bit cheaper. Let's see. The e-cinema solutions are mainly in those non-English, and where not so much the Hollywood content is shown, and the security levels aren't so high there. That's where e-cinema has flourished a lot. That's why Nepal and India, for example, is of that. Well, Australia with e-cinema and film has basically flourished together. E-cinema more in the independent market, for example. So you need to look at the regions and see what works best for there. It depends where you are. Like I said before, e-cinema can give you a better quality than Blu-ray. Can do a 422, 8 or 10-bit is very common, easy to do these days. So that is considerably better than Blu-ray's 420, which I'm not a big fan of myself. It really makes the noise pop to me, and if you're going to go to that much trouble, go DCI, or if at the very most, get an eCinema file which is closer to the quality of the actual master. How to get to a DCP or eCinema file or a Blu-ray? Well, there's open source tools to do a lot of that. I do not recommend you use them unless you really, really know what you're doing, and that's usually not the case. Avoid using bedroom encoders, which means that someone who knows roughly what they're doing but is just doing it on the side and doesn't really have the facilities to do it properly. So I would say, if possible, go to a specialist DCP encoding facility. And if that's the case, if you're going to a good facility, usually they will have they'll do the encode, but they'll test the encode. They'll run it through a DCI player, they'll run it through an eCinema player that's used in that region, and they'll make sure it works and no problems occur. And this is extremely important. Imagine if you made the file and you distributed it 100 times and there's 100 wasted distributions because the file happened to be faulty or something like that. So it's sort of like insurance. You want to go to somewhere that's experienced and knows what they're doing, because there's an insurance policy to ensure that you don't have any problems. And I can't say at the bottom there, cannot stress, if you can afford it, use an encoder who knows what they're doing, is qualified. So next page. What to supply and encoding facility. Well, DCDM, or a digital cinema digital master. The standard for that is 16-bit TIFFs and audio stems, like a monotrack per channel of audio. But that's usually if you're coming from a different type of, well, that's a standardized version of how to distribute. It was a standardized version that's recommended by the DCI, movies.com and the specifications there, but it's not always happening that way. So common ways is it might come in the mastering format that it was done in. For example, if it was online in ProRes for 10-bit blah blah blah, it might come in some movie files like that, and the encoder might just take that and do the right job to get it to a DCP. DPX files, same, that might be mastered in. These DPX files are very common when doing a high quality, better than 8-bit master, and might come in that sort of file format. Again, here the typical color space is Rec 709, which is typical, like if you're doing a typical video type production. But you really, I'll go into color management later on, but that's probably the most problematic area of the whole issue. Getting someone who understands how the color's going through the whole workflow. Like I said before, audio files. Basically, usually you want to have all the audio files as stems, which means that each left, right, center, are all separate mono files. But it's not uncommon to also have a single audio file, which they're all in that single file. You might have a 6-channel audio file. A good facility would be able to deal with that, but in some ways they prefer it, or I would prefer it if I was doing it in stems which are well labelled, as to make sure that no mistakes. So you want to make sure it's easy to make a mistake here, and it's easy to make a mistake, and it's easy to go a long way down the cost chain before you discover the mistake. So obviously you want to avoid that at all costs. So things you should, there's best practices to try and make that, make sure you don't make any mistakes. Talk to the facility or the encoder that you're talking to, the person doing the work, and he would have probably a workflow that he's familiar with and how he may want you to preference on it, and I would basically try and go down his preference because he's less likely to make a mistake or any mistakes to get in there. Now, like I said before, color management. Now, this is probably one of the more, because there's a bit of a black art, the color management, getting it right. So it's very difficult, and it's easy to get wrong because people don't know what they're looking at. So you want to know someone who's doing, usually whoever's doing it, you want them to get in from the mastering side to the DCP side, so they can actually see what's been done in the color there and make sure that is carried through to the mastering side and nothing goes wrong. There's a few comments on there. It gets complex, DPX files, DIs, etc. In general, a good editor or workflow consultant should understand this. So you want to, if you're having any issues there, I'd suggest you talk to them. Scope or flat. Now, this isn't such a big problem, but it's something commonly forgotten. As you can see there, DCI specifies scope or flat, and there's the resolutions there, which I mentioned before. Now, DCI flat is similar to HD 1920 by 1080, and it's very common. A lot of people do a HD workflow, and at the very last step they say, "Oh, I want to get to do a DCP," and commonly they just do a slight zoom in to get it to 1990, zoom it up to 1998 res. Now, this is a small zoom, and we must remember that any resize has quality issues. You should be aware of this. Avatar was shot in 1920 by 1080, but did you notice? No, but so if it's done right, it's not a big issue, but keep it in mind. Do you need encryption? Well, DCI supports encryption, requires KDMs or keys per player or per screen to unlock. And you have to get public certificate from each screen, and then put that into your key generation software generated key. So there's a lot of management going on here, and it costs money, and there's a lot of, it's a significant cost to incur. Now, if you're not, this is expensive. You should only consider this if you have high profile independent feature or better, otherwise it is probably unjustified. Okay, so keep that in mind, and you may want to talk to someone about that and the costs of it. It's getting cheaper as time goes on by the looks of it, but it's an issue you need to really look at and do a ROI, return on investment sort of analysis if you want to go down that path. But in general, the rule of thumb is that if you're doing a small independent or documentary, that you generally don't want to bother. It's not really going to be worth the time.